Thank you, guys. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thank you, Elise, for inviting me to come and talk. Can everybody hear me okay towards the back? Okay, just want to make sure I'm projecting all right. I had the pleasure of touring the garden and going along the trail earlier with Frank and Barbara. Really impressive, the amount of land management and restoration that you guys are doing here. So really cool effort. I'm really happy that that's happening in little pockets all over the state and the region. And Elise, thank you for all your help coordinating with the trip and for the extra time tonight. An hour and a half is a long time to talk. It's also a long time to sit and listen. So please, if you need to get up and move around, get some water or refreshment while I'm talking, please do whatever you need to be comfortable. I am going to be sitting just because recently found out we're expecting our second little one. Thank you. So I am feeling a little dizzy and strange most of the time. So I don't lose my breath. I'm going to be sitting, but do whatever you need to do to be comfortable throughout the talk tonight as well. I think that we're probably all here because we appreciate the beauty and the function of native plants. And I think for native plant enthusiasts, a lot of time function is beauty. So we're going to talk a bit tonight about function of a lot of native plants, for the function that native plants have and the relationships that these plants have with humans over the last centuries. So whatever your purpose is for being here, whether you're more interested in maybe gardening, adding some of these plants to your garden, or making herbal preparations, or just simply learning about history and Native American use of plants, I do hope that you'll leave feeling more grateful for and more connected to, and like you've built another dimension of your relationship to your native plant landscape. So during the talk tonight, we're going to be exploring a handful, or a little bit more than a handful, of native medicinal plants in our region. We'll talk about their growth habits and their uses, both historically, Native American uses, as well as folk and uses by settlers that came into the area, and then how they're used currently within modern Western herbalism. And what, if anything, the scientific and medical literature has to add to that conversation on certain plants. So Elise already gave me a great introduction, but a little bit more about me. I do, as Elise said, I currently work as a research coordinator at UGA. Our lab does research in agricultural sustainability, so that's where my work lies right now. I also did my master's in natural resources, focus on human dimensions. So I've always been really interested in understanding the relationships between environment and people, because I think the stronger that relationship is, the more likely we are to care about the environment, the more likely we are to conserve and protect it and see it as like really a part of who we are and a part of us and something that we depend and rely on rather than just that's outside. So when I was doing my master's, I was taking all these really cool classes in native plant conservation and habitat management. And while I was doing that and doing research, I was also in this year-long herbalism program at the Botanologos school, which is in Clayton, Georgia. If you haven't heard of it, you can look them up. They do a lot of like plant walks and hikes and classes and workshops from like, a weekend to a week long to a year long. So I did a year-long program while I was doing my master's. So I was walking these two kind of different roads, one much more academic, one much more applied and folksy. And I was able to merge those paths when I had the opportunity to start working with the State Botanical Garden of Georgia in Athens, where I started teaching a workshop on native medicinal plants. And I've been doing that for, I think, 6 years now. I think this is the 6th year. So unofficially or less officially, I'm a gardener, a farmer. I've worked on a lot of farms over the years. I love growing food. I love growing herbs. My garden is in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I live with my partner in conservation, Adrian, who he works for Oconee River Land Trust based in Georgia, working with conservation easements, and our son, Jules, who's a year and a half now, and he's already an avid gardener, or at least he gets dirty every morning and totally soaked every morning after breakfast in the garden. So I brought from our garden elderflower and lemon cordial. So I should have left a note of like how to add it to your drink. So I'm sorry if you had a huge gulp of basically sugar water, but it's essentially an elderflower and lemon infused simple syrup. So you just add like a shot of it to your sparkling water or to champagne or whatever. And I can send the recipe to Elise after the presentation if anyone is interested in making that after, because there's lots of elderflower blossoms around right now. It's a great time to be making it. So I do have herbal knowledge that I apply to myself and to my family and friends to some degree, but I'm not a clinical or registered herbalist, so I don't feel super comfortable, giving people advice in that capacity. But I do love sharing herbal knowledge to get people interested and invested in just discovering more for themselves. And I do, like I said, I think getting to know these plants more closely and in new ways helps just bring the picture into sharper focus. So I like to think of my learning about native plants like a landscape scene. And at first, when I began down this path, it was just kind of like blobs of green, different shades of green, like an abstract painting. And the more I've come to build relationships with these plants and really know them and like know their stories, the picture just comes into sharper and sharper focus with more detail and more subtle colors. So I guess that's my goal today, is just to kind of get you to meet and greet with some of these plants so that you can start to form more of a relationship or get to know them in a new way. Maybe you know their use in the garden, or you grow it all the time, but you never knew that it was used for hundreds of years to help when kids had fevers or something. So it just like adds to your appreciation of those plants. All right. So as we get started, I just want to kind of give some background on plant medicine in general. So the global picture, about half or over half of therapeutic products contain or are synthesized from plants. So that's like over the counter as well as prescription medications, anything used for therapies. And then about a quarter of prescription medications contain an herbal derivative. So that's a huge amount of the medicines that we're using in conventional medicine all the time that have plants to thank for their healing properties. So things like Madagascar periwinkle for chemotherapy drugs, poppy obviously we use for pain and cough, digitalis foxglove is used for heart problems, and now this is going to seem like a non sequitur, but can anyone name a really famous Van Gogh painting? Sunflowers, yes. Any others come to mind? Starry Night. Okay, yes, yeah. I took two. So Van Gogh's Starry Night and other paintings, a lot of his other famous paintings, I think sunflowers as well, were painted during what we call his yellow period. So this was a period where a lot of his paintings had tons of yellow tones, as well as glowing, oh, sorry, I didn't hit the, as well as glowing orbs around a lot of the light sources, or like the halo effect around light sources. And one theory is that this tendency to paint in yellow hues and these kind of glowing orb around the light sources may have reflected his actual like visual perception of the world at that time. And what could have caused that? Well, glowing orbs around lights as well as yellow toned vision is actually a side effect of digitalis or foxglove toxicity. And he happened to paint this portrait of his doctor at the time, Dr. Gachet, with what appears to be foxglove in a cup in front of him, and it's believed that he was taking digitalis for epilepsy at the time. So this foxglove is not one of our natives, but I think it's just a really cool story to demonstrate how beneficial plant compounds we find in a lot of our medicines today have really fascinating histories and stories, and like really strong, relationships with humans, and our use of those before they're discovered by science. So zooming in now, my main area of study is the Southern Appalachians, which here in Carrollton, we're in the Piedmont, or the foothills of the main mountain range. So I'll be talking about plants that live across a variety of plant communities across these ecoregions. I tried to mainly focus on ones that you guys have in your immediate area. I did some Facebook snooping and looked at pictures of plants that you had in the garden, so I could build my plant list off of things that I knew you could go and like see and touch and smell and all of that, because I think it's important to be able to have the real world experience with the plant. And we're just situated in a really special pocket of the world. The Appalachians are one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, formed over 250 million years ago, and because of the unique geologic history and the climate here, we live kind of in or right on the cusp of a really botanically diverse forest system, and one that's often referred to as a temperate rainforest. Now, if anybody here has familiarity with native plants of Eastern Asia, which are often used as ornamental plants in a lot of gardens in our area, you may have noticed something a little bit peculiar, and that is that these two regions, Eastern North America, so like the Appalachian Range, and Eastern Asia, obviously separated by thousands of miles of land and sea, but they happen to share a lengthy list of related plant species. And if you think about like plants that we see in kind of our forest ecosystems all the time, dogwood, sweet gum, tulip tree, and also many of our most well-known medicinal plant species like ginseng, witch hazel, Solomon seal. All of these plant genera have close relatives in Eastern Asia. And there you go. We started recognizing this connection in like around the 1700s, when European botanists started making plant lists in both of these regions. And there are a couple of hypotheses about how this came to be, but most scientists agree that this particular disjunction, what we call a botanical or floristic disjunction, came about because there was a huge, like basically a huge, like connected forest that spread across all of the northern hemisphere, across like land bridges that existed at the time tens of millions of years ago, and that decreased over time due to continental drift and then different climatic factors, glaciation periods, and glacial scraping. And we basically have these two little pockets that still exist in the globe of these like distant ancient relatives of plants that are super connected, which I think is really cool. And when we look at this through our medicinal herb lens, it makes total sense that there are such strong medicinal herb traditions among like traditional Chinese and Japanese medicine, and then North American herbalism. So while Chinese healers were using ginseng hundreds of years ago to increase vitality and stimulate appetite in the elderly and people who were recovering from illness, the Cherokee were using ginseng as well to increase appetite in the elderly and help people who had like debilitating diseases, give them energy and things like that. So there's a lot of overlap, even though these two things are happening separate parts of the globe without any real connection. And modern herbalists today are able to use North American and Asian herbal traditions in a really complementary way. Okay, so before we talk more about the native plants of our region and their history, I want to acknowledge the people who first came to know these plants and their uses, over hundreds, potentially thousands of years of trial and error. And most locally, this is the Creek or Muskogee people. When we zoom out more broadly into the Southern Appalachians, the predominant First Peoples nations were Muskogee Creek as well as the Cherokee. Even those like monikers didn't exist until they didn't exist prehistorically. They kind of emerged as a response to interaction between the old and new world in the 17th and 18th centuries. So they kind of, they developed out of the debris of what was left after a lot of loss of life because of, contact with European diseases and violence. And so there's so much that's been lost, obviously. And we can't know like the expanse of knowledge and relationship that the people who had been here for like thousands of years had with this place and with these plants, but we can get little wisps of it, and hopefully we can nurture and grow that to a new ethnobotany for ourselves. But so the group that gets referred to most frequently when talking about the historical uses of these plants is the Cherokee, just because that's what we have the most record of. And when it comes to primary sources, a lot of traditional knowledge in this area has been lost just to time and to lack of written record, and just the lack of desire on the part of the dominant culture to save it and preserve it and to consider it like a part of our history. But we can try to triangulate information from a variety of imperfect sources. So we can look to written accounts from white Europeans who were living and interacting with Native American groups in early days of settlement, like this one from historian James Adair, who says, for my own part, I would prefer an old Indian before any surgeon whatsoever. It just, kind of at once demeaning them, but also acknowledging that they had all of this knowledge that they, didn't have. So we have accounts like that. Of course, the information they contain has flaws and gaps and biases, and there is going to be an unevenness in what to the writer's access to the daily life of Indians, and also to understanding what they were seeing if they even did have access. So it's not perfect. There are also oral histories and knowledge that Native people who have remained in these regions after removal have continued to pass down, though, of course, we're still primarily relying on white Westerners' accounts and recordings of this knowledge. These are a couple examples of books written by white folks who closely worked with and wrote about Cherokee and the Creek Indians that I think are, good sources. But even within these, there's evidence that knowledge is withheld from outside individuals and groups. So in Plants of the Cherokee, which I put on the table over here if anyone wants to look at it later, the author, William Banks, talks about encountering a theory that some of the older Indians held that the medicines would actually lose their potence if the knowledge was made common. So things are going to be withheld too. So we have kind of a patchy understanding of the history of these plants and their uses. One more source that we can look to, and if anyone is more interested in digging into historical uses of plants, this is a route I would suggest to take, is looking at a medicinal herbalist group called the Eclectics, which thrived in the 19th to 20th century here in the States. So they actually built their school of medical herbalism using Native American knowledge of the native plants combined with the European herbal knowledge that they had brought over. So this obviously doesn't solve the problem of the white lens through which we're kind of forced to look at history, but this is a significant body of written records that we can look to for some of that history of how Native Americans were using the native plants in our region. And eclectic medicine, it was a branch of American medicine. They had medical schools all across the Midwest and the Eastern U.S., and they trained physicians primarily in the use of botanical remedies. So that was their go-to. And the term eclectic derives from the Greek word meaning to choose from. And it was coined by Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, who's on the far left there, who was a botanist and a professor, and he studied and worked really closely with Native Americans, studying their use of medicinal plants, and kind of formed a good foundation of their body of knowledge for botanical treatments. So this school of medicine really taught how to treat the patient rather than the pathology. It was very like individualized care, and it taught doctors to use the treatments of best fit for the person and the circumstances. So if you were, in New York, the plants might be different than what's available in Georgia. So you would have to use different remedies depending on the circumstances. A lot of the non-eclectic or more like mainstream scientific medical practices at the time included bloodletting and purgatives and surgery without any type of anesthesia. So a lot of people, especially in rural areas, chose to go to eclectic physicians at the time rather than to some of the more conventional medical treatment areas. So another cool thing about eclectic medical schools is that they accepted both African American and white female doctors at the time when other medical schools were not doing that. And in the middle here, we have a portrait of the famous Dr. Mary Walker, who was an eclectic trained physician and surgeon, and she's still the only woman to have ever received the Medal of Honor for her service as a medical care provider during the Civil War for the Union Army, and she was held as a prisoner of war there. She has a really amazing story. And these schools started to decline after something called the Flexner Report, if anyone's heard of that, which was published in 1910. So it was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, and it essentially was a critique of US medical schools, calling for much more like narrow and strict standards for entry and for graduation. And they wanted them to adhere to more strict protocols of like mainstream scientific inquiry. They also just sought to reduce the number of medical schools in the US. So between when the Flexner Report came out in 1910 and 1935, the number of US medical schools was halved, basically. Half of them either merged with other schools or closed their doors entirely. So while it may have introduced a certain standard of rigor, it also largely cut out all but one perspective of medical care. And until 1913, so just a few years after this was published, the US Pharmacopoeia, or the kind of encyclopedia reference of like all of the treatments and remedies that existed, was essentially all herbal until 1913. The last eclectic medical school closed in Cincinnati in 1939, but they have a library and a museum there, and they still have a huge collection of eclectic books and publications from the eclectic schools. And I think we're actually starting to see some of the kind of ethos and wisdom of the eclectic medicine reemerging in modern medical care as we learn more about like genetic factors in health and the way that different types of people respond to medication differently depending on like gender or race or even like your age and like where your metabolism is at, depending on where you are in life. Like we respond to medicines really differently. So I think, medicine overall is becoming more individualized and less pathologized. Okay, so we've gotten some context and background for how we've come to know what we know about the medicinal uses of our native plants. So it's time to meet some plants. Before we jump into our plant list, I would love to know what are some plants that you either have used medicinally or just like know of as like medicinal plants that get used commonly? Aloe, okay. Yeah, just shout them out. St. John's wort, coneflower. Yep, ginseng, plantain, dandelion, hibiscus, yarrow, calendula, arnica, Lots of good ones. Elder, yes. Mugwort. Lemon balm. Mint. Yellow root. Oh, wild lettuce. Nice. Golden seal. All the peppermints, yes. Love the mints. Any others that come to mind? Any other favorites? Black cohosh, yes. Good one. Self-heal. Comfrey, yep, that's a big one. Hops, Anti-anxiety. So many, right? It's like, name a plant that doesn't have a medicinal use. What was that? Poison ivy. Homeopathically, that one does get used. Right. So I don't know how many plants we just named, maybe 20 or so. For comparison, not to make us feel bad, but in context of pre-removal Cherokee, estimated that an average person, not a healer, but just an average person, knew the use of upwards of 200 plant species, and that healers may have known the medicinal value of around 800 plant species. So just to give us a sense for the depth of ethnobotanical knowledge that existed, and I also think that it points just to the sheer diversity of the area and of the region. And it's an area that like a ton of modern herbalists have flocked to just because the medicine cabinet right outside your door is super rich. So, we're going to talk about 20 or so plants. We'll get to know about 20 or so plants a little better this evening. So we are well on our way to 800. Okay, so in each of the plant slides, I added some characteristic symbols, just meant to be like a quick reference for the growing conditions and wildlife interest of each plant in case that's what you're most interested in, maybe adding it to your garden and want to know a bit about what it needs. Their meanings are pretty straightforward, I think. With the water requirement key, I'm kind of indicating the most extreme that a plant can handle, but there's often more of a range that's going to vary depending on the type of soil and also the amount of sun that it's getting. You'll also see the United Plant Savers symbol at the bottom left corner if that plant is listed as at risk by that group. So I do see my role as an environmental educator and a wildcrafter, first as an act of stewardship. So it's about appreciation first, not about use. And I do use what I grow and what I view as abundant. But for plants that are struggling because of habitat loss and fragmentation, I appreciate them and protect them, and I like to share how special they are. But I don't necessarily feel the need to use them if they're, a plant that's really struggling out there. But for cultures who have a history and tradition of using these plants or have limited access to other types of medical treatment, that I think the issue of use becomes a bit more of a gray area. But for me, if I don't need to use it and it's listed, I'm only going to use the cultivated or leave it alone entirely. But, if you can find a source that's cultivated, awesome. And a lot of the plants that I'll talk about, you can grow yourself. There are a few that are a little trickier, but you can find cultivated sources of most of these. Okay, so our first plant, which hopefully we've all gotten to enjoy a little bit of already this evening, American elderberry. It's one that we should all be on the lookout for right now, along like roadsides and train tracks and power right-of-ways, anywhere that's like a really shrubby, open, sunny green space that gets managed a little bit, but not mowed, but mowed often enough to not have a tree canopy. So elderberry, large shrub to small multi-trunked tree, has these big compound leaves, always with an odd number of leaflets. I think it looks a little bit like sumac when it first starts to pop up, and also a bit like the invasive tree of heaven, just right at the beginning. But it has these big dramatic clusters of tiny white flowers in late spring, early summer. So right now is kind of, we're in between flower to berry time. Um, all of the white flowers start to give way to the really dramatic drooping clusters of these dark purple berries later on in the summer. So historically, the Cherokee used all parts of the plant. They used the leaves for poultices. So a poultice, if you're not familiar with that term, is just like a plant material that's been mashed up and moistened, and you just apply the plant material directly to a wound or an area of issue externally. So it's an external preparation of herbs. So they would use the leaves for poultices for wounds and bruises. They would also make leaf and bark infusions. So like a really strong, an infusion is basically a really strong tea that's used medicinally rather than as a beverage tea. And they would use that as an antiseptic wash for wounds. And then the bark and the leaves are emetic, which means they cause vomiting. So we don't use, herbalists today don't use any parts of the plant other than the flowers and the berries because we don't often need to make ourselves vomit. But in time periods where you may have realized that you've eaten something that you shouldn't have, you ate something toxic, or you ate, rotten meat or something, and you needed to get it up, this was one of the plants that they would use to do so. Let's see, the berries were also used as a food source to make wine. The flowers and berries are still used today. They are one of our few antiviral herbs. So the flowers have antiviral properties, and the berries have immune boosting effects. The berries are also considered diaphoretic, so they're going to help reduce fever, and expectorant, so they'll help you expel mucus. They do have to be cooked, so don't ever eat elderberries raw. You could eat like one just to taste it if you're really curious, but if you eat too many, they will make you sick. You have to cook them. Elderberry syrup, jams, pies, wine. If you have access to the plants as the fruit starts to ripen in the coming weeks, you can dry them and store them. So you can make syrup in the winter when it's more like cold and flu season. I often just harvest a bunch and then I put them on a screen over an air vent in my house and let dry really readily, store them in a jar in the shade for a year or longer, and you can use them that way. In terms of scientific research, because phytomedicine is more culturally mainstream in Europe, a lot of the research on elderberry is done on the European species, so Sambucus nigra, but in practice, the two are really used interchangeably. And there have been quite a lot of double-blind studies which have demonstrated the effectiveness in elderberry in reducing cold and flu duration and the severity of symptoms. There have also been studies which showed no significant difference between the treatment and the control. So it's really inconclusive, and I also think that gets back to this idea of individualized care and finding, the treatment of best fit for different people. If you want to grow it yourself, elderberry is super adaptable. It can be a little bit bullish. I have transplanted some to my yard and now have to knock it back routinely. But they can deal with drier conditions. We have several on a slope in full sun in our yard, but they also like moist conditions. We saw some down by the drainage area today on the walk. So it's a pretty versatile plant, can handle some shade, can handle full sun. They just grow. All right. Our next plant, also blooming right now, giving us a show, bee balm or bergamot. Historically, Native Americans would use the aerial parts to create an infusion, a medicinal tea, which acts as a diaphoretic to induce sweat and relieve fever, also as a digestive aid and to relieve menstrual symptoms. A lot of plants, not all plants, but a lot of plants in the mint family are going to have these same uses. So diaphoretic to help reduce fever, and then digestive aids. So if you've ever had peppermint tea after a really big dinner to help with your digestion, bee balm can be used in the same way. And the Oswego tribe of American Indians, like up in New York, drank it commonly as a beverage tea. And it was actually one of the drinks adopted by American colonialists during their boycott of British tea, because the leaves almost have like a, well, it's called wild bergamot or bergamot herb because it has a similar flavor when brewed as a tea to the bergamot fruit. So they would use it in like lemonades and punches and other cold drinks. Currently, it's still used as an infusion remedy for indigestion and nausea, as well as fevers. You can also make an infusion and pour your boiling water over the leaves and put a towel over your head and do an inhalation to relieve chest congestion. And anything in the mint family, almost anything that has that really like pungent, minty smell and taste to it, you can use in much the same way. Let's see. All right. My son's two favorites, blackberry and black raspberry. Every day we go out in the garden after breakfast and he points to where he knows the berry bushes are and he wants me to go into the brambles and get him little handfuls of berries. So an important food source for babies and wildlife alike, as well as for indigenous people who would even dry them for storage and transportation, living a more nomadic lifestyle. So blackberry leaf is a long-known remedy to the Cherokee for calming an upset stomach. Chewing on blackberry leaves was thought to soothe sore gums. The leaves are an astringent. They have astringent properties. So it is a great tea for stomach troubles that cause diarrhea. Wild black raspberry, on the other hand, as a leaf tea, was given to women to soothe labor pains, to ease contractions and nausea during childbirth. And it's still today viewed as a really important uterine tonic by modern herbalists. Many midwives will advise pregnant women to drink raspberry leaf tea, especially as they get closer to their due date. I did that. It's thought to help stimulate labor, so you don't go past your due date and then some and keep waddling along. It doesn't have any caffeine, but raspberry leaf tea does taste kind of similar to black tea. So this was another one that was popular among colonialists during the boycott on British tea. So the main way that I tell these two apart, well, for one, the black raspberry is going to fruit a lot earlier. So black raspberries are just finishing up their fruiting period. I'm still getting like a couple of berries on a few plants, but they're almost done. And the blackberries are just starting. You see them all over the place. They're a little more obvious. But the black raspberry leaves, unlike the black raspberry leaves will stay a trifoliate, so they'll have 3 leaflets always. They also have, you can see in the picture, a kind of silvery sheen on the stem and on the underside of the leaves if you flip them over. And it's actually like a powdery coating that rubs off. And then the black raspberries, when you pull the berries off, they, like a store-bought red raspberry, have that concave cup. So you can tell the difference that way. Okay. This is one that somebody shouted out earlier. Black cohosh. This is a really elegant plant to grow or stumble upon in the woods. Another name for it is fairy torches. So it has these like wispy wand-like stalks or racemes that emerge in summer. Mine at home started flowering a couple of weeks ago. It has deeply divided compound leaves, which look a lot like a lot of other foliage when it's not flowering. So this is one that I would encourage folks to watch over the seasons and make sure you see it flower if you aren't 100% certain. I would say that with anything, that's one of the most important, I think, teachings I got from my herbal teacher is just that you always want to have 100 to 110% confidence in your ID. So if you're not sure, And you can't just identify it from the foliage. Watch it over an entire year before you are going to harvest it and use it. Just make sure you see the flower and you're absolutely certain. One of the lookalikes for black cohosh is called white baneberry or doll's eye, and it is toxic, so it's not one that you want to confuse. It also looks similar to blue cohosh and to yellowroot, I think, which are both used medicinally as well, but for different purposes. Historically, the roots were soaked in alcohol to make a treatment for rheumatic pain, so an external treatment, and a decoction of the root. So with like woody parts and roots, like thicker parts of the plant, you make a decoction. And with the aerial parts or the more delicate parts of a plant, you make an infusion. Those are just like herbalism terms, but it's basically just a strong tea. They're used, two different terms because the decoction, you're going to actually simmer the woodier parts or the thicker, denser parts of the plant in water, whereas with the more delicate parts, you want to just pour boiling water over the top rather than like cooking it down. But think if you make like ginger tea with like actual ginger root, you want to like simmer it in the water for a while for like 10 minutes or so to get the medicinal properties. So with black cohosh, you're using the root and you're making what's called a decoction, and it has antispasmodic and anti-inflammatory and analgesic properties. So it's going to help with inflammation, with spasmodic coughs. So if you have a really like spasmy cough where you just feel like you have to keep coughing over and over again, really helps for that. And for like cold and flu-like symptoms because of that analgesic properties, it's pain relieving. Currently, the uses remain pretty much the same as historically. It's also used as what's called a tonic herb. So tonic just means that we're using it for more like chronic and long-term problems rather than acute problems, or as a like restoring a certain body system. So this is a really important herb in women's health. So alleviating symptoms associated with PMS and with menopause. Also used to promote fertility through regulation and support of the reproductive system. And it's actually one of the most like prescribed medications for women going through menopause, specifically for hot flashes. So in Germany, this is really heavily used. It's actually, black cohosh is actually one of our most studied herbs in Europe. And it's been prescribed there by gynecologists for over 50 years. And there are a lot of clinical demonstrations showing effectiveness in boosting progesterone levels. So that's an indicator of healthy ovulation. And then studies have confirmed it as an effective treatment for menopausal symptoms. And it's preferred treatment in places like Germany and France. It's really common. If it's something that you want to grow yourself, it's often found in shade gardens. It's naturally an understory species, but if you see this photo, in places where it's cultivated really readily for commercial purposes, they'll actually put it in full sun, and it does great. You just have to monitor the water and make sure that it stays nice and moderately moist all the time. But yeah, you can put it in a shade garden. You could put it at the edge of your garden and mostly sun, and it does really great. I have a few that I've transplanted over the years that are just gorgeous. Okay, our next herb is boneset. This is common boneset. This is a wildflower that you'll see kind of like a ditchweed, just like along roadsides and in ditches, and usually around like 3 feet tall, but it can get pretty tall in the right spots. It has these small clusters of white flowers beginning in the summer. But there are a lot of plants that look, somewhat similar. So the big tell for me in identifying boneset is how like wrinkly and almost scaly the leaves look. And then, as the Latin name suggests, for foliatum, the stem appears to be going like straight through the opposite paired leaves, which are joined at the stem. So it almost looks like one kind of long leaf with the stem poked through like a straw. So that's the big tell for, something being definitely bone set with those white flowers. Historically, it was widely used by Native American groups and European settlers as a remedy for cold and flu. It was prescribed a lot by early medical doctors, and its colloquial name, bone set, may have come to be because it was used to treat fevers that felt like they were breaking your bones. Like dengue fever specifically was said to feel like your bones were just breaking inside of your body. So this was a really common one given to people who were suffering from intense like fever and like flu-like symptoms. It was also used for treating malaria, and very cool recent research found that it contains a compound which has anti-protozoal activity that acts against one particular mosquito vector or that causes malaria. Currently, it's still used as a kind of go-to treatment for colds and flus and fevers. It's a diaphoretic, so reduces fever, analgesic, helps with pain. Studies out of Germany have demonstrated immune system stimulating effects as well. And it's also a bitter herb. So if you're familiar with bitter herbs, anything that like tastes bitter to the tongue will help stimulate digestion. It helps, my herb teacher would always say, it helps get things moving in the right direction. So it'll stimulate the production of bile and just help if you eat a little bit of something bitter before you have a big meal or immediately after you have a big meal, it just helps things get started and move along in the right direction. If you want to grow this one yourself, I have read, not from experience, but I've read that seed germination is typically low, but you can find some at nurseries, and it's really easy to divide the plant in spring or fall. We went and dug a bunch of plants up where we knew there was like a huge abundance of them. We dug some up from a power line right away and planted them along the edge of our vegetable garden to help with pollinators. So it grows and spreads pretty well once it's established. And it'll grow in like really clay heavy soils and sandy soils, just gonna need more water and sandy. Let's see, the only warning I want to give, there is a toxic lookalike, white snakeroot, which the flowers look super similar. We actually have white snakeroot in our yard as well. And we were calling it bone set for a while. And then I was like, oh, that's definitely not bone set. I did the little like leaf check with the straw poking through the stem straw. I was like, yeah, that's not bone set. That's snakeroot. Snakeroot, the leaves are totally different. They're more like heart-shaped and they don't have the stem going through the center. If you're familiar with something called milk sickness, this was a plant that was a huge pest, a huge problem. In centuries past, especially in cow pastures. So cows would eat snakeroot and it would actually poison the milk from the cows. So then the butter, cheese, whatever you're making from the milk would then become toxic. And it is thought to have actually been the cause of Lincoln's mother's death. So we want to avoid snakeroot, especially if you have livestock. There was a big effort to just eradicate snakeroot, years and years ago, decades ago, when it was becoming a problem because farmers were recognizing, oh, this is growing in my pasture, people are getting sick. So it's been knocked back, I would say, but it's still one to look out for and make sure we're not confusing it. Oh, it'll poison the meat. I did not know that. Thank you for adding. All right. Our next sweet little plant, bloodroot. This is one of the earliest spring blossoms as we're walking around moist woodland areas. Traditionally, bloodroot has been used to burn off cancerous growths, ulcers and polyps and warts and all kinds of things, and fungal infections as well. You can see in the picture of this slice of root, so it's called bloodroot for a reason. It contains this compound called sanguinarine, like blood, that is very caustic sap. So if you ever are transplanting it or digging it up, you want to wear gloves or wash your hands really quickly because it can burn the skin. But it's a really strong plant medicine for using externally to get rid of unwanted growths on the skin. So it would be applied as a paste with other herbs and left on for a day or longer to remove the problem. Probably a pretty painful way to take care of things, but I actually did have a friend that used it on a cancerous growth on her face, and it was not a pretty process, but she managed to take care of the issue. She didn't have health insurance, and that was, the way that she decided to take care of it. But I would definitely recommend not harvesting and using bloodroot unless you're working with a trained herbalist. And herbalists actually call bloodroot a low dose botanical. So it just means that it's a more highly toxic herb than many others. It's not quite as safe to just use kind of willy-nilly. So they only use it in very low doses, usually in combination with other herbs in formulas. So it is a really important herb for treating really bad cough and upper respiratory infections and bronchitis. It's added to formulas and taken as a tincture for that. And then externally, it's still used in salves for skin growths. Interestingly, sanguinarine, the compound that makes the sap red, was used in toothpaste and mouthwashes for many decades because it was found to be very effective at reducing plaque and gingivitis. So studies since then have linked mouthwash that contains sanguinarine with the development of certain oral cancers. So it was removed as an ingredient in toothpaste and mouthwash, I think mostly in like the 80s and 90s, so we don't have it anymore. If it's one that you want to grow yourself, like I said, make sure to wear gloves and wash your hands afterwards. But during the dormant period in fall and early winter, you can dig up mature bloodroot rhizomes and you can cut them into 2 each segments. You just want to make sure that they have at least one bud attached to each segment, and then plant them in really soft, organic matter-rich soil, 1 to 2 inches deep with the buds facing up, and space them a little bit apart. And just you want to mulch it really well and maintain that soil moisture so they grow in usually in like shaded slopes and hillsides, like as you're getting close to water, places that are staying really nice and moist and shady. All right, let me get an elder sip. So I always feel a little bit silly putting this one in the presentation because it's just so well known, right? But echinacea, I think, is always worth chatting about. And I think it's helpful to know, too, which species are used within, like, the current herbal world. Very iconic, pale, bright purple flower heads. We can get them on license plates in Tennessee. I don't know about Georgia. They're composite flowers, so they have that spiky brown porcupine center composed of the tiny disc florets, and then they open up sequentially in a whorled pattern, which is really cool. They mature from the outer base to the center, and then what looks like petals are actually called the ray florets. So 2 types of flowers in the head. Historically, it's funny, in my research, there's really no record of use of echinacea by the Cherokee, but it's said to have been one of the most used plants among Native American groups that were living more in like the plains and in the prairie environment. So they would use it for everything from spider and snake bites because of its immune properties. So almost like a Benadryl type effect. So taking it after you've had an allergic reaction to something, as well as colds and flu. which is still I think the most common modern use. And European settlers would use it for bacterial and viral infections. And it in the 1800s to early 1900s, it was said to be the most prescribed medicine in the U.S. by physicians, or most prescribed medicinal plant in the U.S. So before antibiotics, really, it was really heavily relied on for people with infections. Even anything to like sepsis, gangrene, any gnarly infection. Currently, you can find echinacea products all over. It's teas, lozenges, cold and flu fighting prevention, and it's also used in salves externally for external infection. And it's also one of the most studied herbs when it comes to scientific trials, with really mixed results. So you can find studies showing effectiveness, other studies showing no effect, which might be attributable to the type of extract and the type of species that the studies are using. We just don't really know. But one cool thing that has been studied is how bacteria produce an enzyme that breaks down hyaluronic acid, which is a compound that we have in our bodies that binds cells together. So echinacea inhibits the activity of this enzyme. So it is really good for topical use as kind of a neosporin substitute. So if you made a salve, and just a quick take on salves, you essentially just make an infused oil with whatever plant you want to make the salve of, infuse the oil. You can do that in a low heat oven. You can do the solar method where you just stick it in a jar in the oil and put it in the sun during the summer for a few days. And then you just add beeswax to melted beeswax on the stovetop slowly to that oil until you get it to the consistency that you want, and you have a salve. So I can also include a little salve recipe in materials that I send to Elise after. Growing it yourself, this is one that we see all over the place because it's super easy. It's a really fun, bright, colorful plant to add to a garden. It likes full sun, can handle a little bit of shade, can tolerate drier conditions. It'll look less haggard with moderate water, but it expands pretty quickly. It's really easy to divide and break apart. You can also grab the seed heads and just scatter them all over your garden. Okay. Our next plant is fringe tree. This is one that's a good example of a botanical disjunct. So we have Chinese fringe tree, which you might find more commonly at like big box store nurseries. But the native fringe tree, it's a really enchanting tree. I think it's a nice size for a garden or yard. Excuse me, in the same vein as like a dogwood or a redbud. Historically, the main record of Native American use is from the Choctaw, who used it externally as a poultice for cuts and bruises, and for a wound wash for infected sores. Before pharmaceuticals, physicians used the bark tincture to treat jaundice and hepatitis. So it has some effects on the gallbladder. Currently, it is still used for liver and gallbladder related health problems. It's considered one of the best herbs for prevention and treatment of gallstones. And it's thought to stimulate bile flow and relieve gastrointestinal bloating and discomfort. And it's one I made a tincture for my mom when she was having gallbladder issues. We think it helped. She didn't have to have her gallbladder removed, but she also really just did a complete overhaul in her diet. So I think that's probably one of the main things. But yeah, it's a really important herb for gallbladder problems. There's not a lot of research to support the use, but analysis of the leaves has shown comparable levels of the same compound found in olive leaves, also in olives and olive oil. And it's known to be antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and have cholesterol and blood sugar lowering effects. If it's one that you want to grow yourself, it is pretty slow growing. It can grow in full shade, but you're not going to get the same showy, display of flowers as you will with more sun. I have one planted in our yard in full sun, and it's still small. It's wee, but it's doing great. The fruits are favored by birds. So blue jays, cardinals, mockingbirds, and even wild turkeys are really a fan of the fruits of the fringe tree. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think you would. Okay. Maybe there's another one nearby. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. That's a great question. Yeah. Yeah, I'll look that up. Okay, our next one is super well known, I think, and maybe a little notorious. There have been reality TV shows about ginseng hunters, and the reason being this plant, ginseng, has been used extensively by people across the globe for a long, hundreds and hundreds of years. So Asian ginseng, this is again one of our botanical disjuncts. So there's Asian ginseng, there's Korean ginseng, and there's American ginseng. All Native American people and people in like traditional Chinese medicine tradition have been using this plant for, it's basically a panacea. It's named Panax, which is the Greek for all healing, because Carl Linnaeus knew the reputation of Asian ginseng for curing literally anything that ails you, and that's kind of how it's still viewed. And it's become more and more prized, I think, over the years because populations have declined. It's been overharvested in Asia, so the Asian market was really desirous of the American ginseng that was growing here. So then it's become overharvested here as well, unfortunately. So this is not something that I would go, looking for and digging up, in the wild. But it is something that I think more and more people are making available to cultivate. And I think there's a large market in cultivation. I have some friends who are growing golden seal and ginseng and a few of those like really high value herbs. They just take a lot of patience. They're a bit of an investment. So medicinally, all of the ginseng species are going to help with essentially the signs and symptoms of life on earth. So as a human, so it helps the body and the mind cope with stress and overwork and poor sleep and poor diet, trauma, aging. It keeps people more cognitively alert and coordinated. I know. And that's why it's incredibly expensive. Patricia, my herb teacher, said she visited China and she went to one of these herb shops that's very like they're very kind of guarded and private, and you walk in and it's very like formal. And she said she wanted to purchase ginseng, and they bring out these roots on a cloth tray, like a velvet tray, and they show you the roots, and it's very fancy. And apparently, the more the root looks like a human form, the more valuable the root is. So they'll pay thousands of dollars for a root. Yeah, and that you don't even want to begin harvesting ginseng until it's at least like almost a decade old. So a lot of these roots are like decades old, and incredibly valuable. But when you're harvesting the root, you're harvesting the whole plant, kaput. That's it. So that's one of the problems with using ginseng and the increasing demand for ginseng. So it's been basically hunted to near extinction, but it does still exist in areas wild pockets across the Appalachian region. I was just looking at a study that looked at the population density and harvest to market amounts across the US, and there's a significant correlation between the wild harvested amount and poverty rates in a given area. So it's kind of, it's kind of like a last ditch thing in areas that have lost certain industries and, just don't have a lot of opportunities. This is something that's a quick way to earn money. Apparently it's tricky to grow. You have to get like the shade just right and the like orientation to the sun just right. But you can find rootstock for sale online. And it's an investment in the future. It's something you could put in the ground and see what happens over a decade, like planting a tree and watching that tree become large over time. So I mean, it's almost like the mythos of ginseng is something to really treasure and hold on to. I don't think so. I think it's going to be mostly hardwood or mixed forest. That's going to be ideal for that. Yes, north facing slope. Are you growing it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and you can find cultivated sources. Like people have started growing it because there's such a market. Like if it was something that you did want to like try, as an herb to take, like you can find cultivated sources. But I wouldn't just like buy it from anywhere. Definitely do your research and make sure that you're buying from a reputable source, someone who's growing it thoughtfully. So similar story with golden seal. Another one that I kind of hesitate to put on the list because it is listed as an at-risk species and endangered in Georgia actually due to overharvesting combined with development and loss of habitat. So again, I wouldn't harvest it in the wild, but I have not grown golden seal. I have read that it is fairly easy to cultivate. So if you can find farm sources as opposed to wild harvested, I have actually found plants for sale at native plant nurseries. If you ever make the 2.5 hour drive to Chattanooga, if you're in the area, there's a great native plant nursery called Reflection Riding Plant Nursery. Reflection riding, like riding a horse. So they have some horses there. And they have an awesome native plant nursery that it's all native plants, and they have some more unusual things than what I found at other native plant nurseries. They have golden seal. I've seen it there every time I've been. So it's one that you can pot it up and plant it in your yard, and help get the population up. I think it's a really darling little plant. It has basically like a tiny little double umbrella with 2 leaves. Looks really similar to mayapple in its like growth habit. Distinguishing characteristic for me is the one flower that is mostly just like a bunch of long white stamens, and it hovers right over the leaves, and it eventually becomes what looks like a little raspberry almost. But don't eat it. The fruit is not edible. Historically, Cherokee used golden seal to treat cancers, for digestive issues, poor appetite, ulcers. They would also use it externally as a wash for skin infection and inflammation. Is also used as a folk remedy for eye infections. And actually, components of the root were used in commercial eye washes until the 1980s. Currently, it's considered a local antibacterial. It's also a bitter, so it helps stimulate digestion like all those other bitter herbs. It's also a very drying herb, so it helps to dry out mucus. So golden seal is not something I would take at the beginning of a cold necessarily when you still have an infection, but at the end when you're past the infectious part, when you don't have a fever anymore, but you just have excess mucus you're trying to clear out, golden seal is really good for drying that up. The roots and rhizomes contain a lot of important phytochemicals. Berberine is what gives the root that bright yellow and golden color. It's also, berberine is also the main component in yellow root. And berberine helps to stimulate bile, and so that helps with that digestive element. And it also is a liver tonic, so it's thought to help support your overall like liver and kind of the toxicity filtration of the body. So yeah, you can find plants for sale. I would definitely recommend trying to grow it on your own. It's not one that's going to be really showy or attract a bunch of pollinators, but it has been observed to be visited by some small bees, small tiny bee species that need they need flowers too, and the fruit is believed to be consumed by the wild turkey. Okay, goldenrod. Goldenrod gets bad rap because it blooms at the same time as ragweed, and everyone thinks that goldenrod is what's making them sneeze, but typically it's ragweed because goldenrod actually has, if you look at their flowers really closely, like they're really kind of closed in, and their pollen is very sticky, so the pollen is not dispersed and in the air the same way that the ragweed pollen is. So most likely you're not reacting to goldenrod if you're getting those late summer allergic reactions. There are a lot of goldenrod species. They can hybridize with one another, but the most common here is Solidago canadensis. The Cherokee used a root tea for summer complaint. And I think some of that does have to do with allergies, so it's still used by herbalists today. Usually as a leaf tea or the aerial parts, as part of a formula for actually preventing allergies during the spring and summer, and for basically, alleviating cold and flu type symptoms as well. It also has antibacterial properties, so for upper respiratory infections, and it's considered a diuretic and an anti-inflammatory herb, so it's used for kidney and urinary tract problems, such as kidney stones. This is another plant that is not used much in the US, like officially, but it has a stronghold in European phytomedicine. So there's some research, animal and test tube studies show that it might help relieve muscle spasms and lower blood pressure and fight infections. And then this is another, a lot like coneflower that is super easy. It's hardy, it's resilient. A lot of people consider it a weed because it just grows all over the place without anybody helping it along. But I think it's really beautiful. I've heard people call it summer's end because it gives you that burst of color right at the end of summer into fall. I actually used it to fill a bunch of bouquets for my friend's wedding because it was the only thing flowering in October. But it's a really nice one, an easy one to add to your garden. And it attracts a lot of, later in the season pollinators, as well as finches. All right. Joe Pye. This is a big guy. It's a herbaceous perennial. It can grow up to 12 feet tall. It's got these big pink bursts of flowers at the end of the stem during the summer. It really, to me, looks like a plant that's celebrating. The leaves are pretty characteristic, so they're lance-shaped and they're in whorls of 5 or more leaflets up the stem. Historically, the Cherokee would actually use the hollow stems of the Joe Pye to bubble or blow air into herbal medicines to activate them. And then a tea of the whole plant was taken internally for rheumatic pain, painful urination, and kidney infection and gout. The legend behind the colloquial name is that Joe Pye was a kind of like snake oil salesman in the early 1900s who marketed the leaf as a cure for typhoid fever. because it induced sweating. Today, the root is still used. So the root is the part that herbalists use today to restore function to the urinary tract, particularly for people who get urinary stones. So hence the common name gravel root. And the leaf is used as a diaphoretic and an analgesic. It is one that has been when researched, it's been flagged as potentially damaging to the liver in high doses. So it's one that you'd want to explore with caution and not use, over a long time period. Mayapple, lovely little plants. Short little woodland perennial, similar to golden seal. The leaves pop up in spring like little umbrellas, and they have this really shy, almost hidden flower below the leaves, as you can see in the photo. And then those give way to a fruit later on in the summer that is edible, but it's only edible when it's totally, completely ripe, when it's like a deep yellow and it's really wrinkly and looks almost rotten. So it's mostly hidden from human sight, but it is a favorite food of the eastern box turtle, which have kind of a symbiotic relationship with them. And that scientists think now that they probably evolved together. So the turtles will eat the fruit and then go back to the water, poop out the seeds, and then the plants will spread close to water, and you'll get these like little patches of them all over. So if you see a really healthy patch of mayapple, you can also assume a really healthy turtle population in that area. I was doing some research on the medicinal uses. So this is not one that you would just use as a medicine. It is all parts of the plant except for the really ripe fruit are toxic, but it is one that has been really well researched by the scientific medical community, and they're actually using compounds from the plant to create cancer drugs, particularly for, I think it's testicular cancer and for certain types of lung cancer. So I saw that the Asian, so this is another botanical disjunct. So the Asian species of mayapple, ours cousin, has been harvested almost to extinction because it has been used for its anti-cancer properties. But the ARS, the Agricultural Research Service, in 2020 came out with news that they developed a new extraction method from the leaves rather than needing to like harvest the entire plant. So the plant can continue to grow, and that could potentially turn the American mayapple into an alternative crop to use for these anti-cancer drugs, and maybe as a cash crop for U.S. growers as well. Okay. So our next plant, purple passion flower. This one you find growing all over the place. It's a nice volunteer. A non-woody climbing vine. The flowers are so intricate and fascinating. I just think they're one of the most beautiful flowers. They look like cut paper or something. The Cherokee use this plant for food as well as medicine. So it produces an edible fruit. If you've never grabbed one and eaten it off the plant, you should. It tastes really funky and strange and fruity and sweet and sour and weird. But the fruits were consumed. They'd also make them into a drink. The young leaves and shoots were also eaten, and the root was pounded to make a poultice for skin inflammation. An infusion of the leaf and flower were used to calm infants and as a sedative for restlessness and insomnia. And it's still used in much the same way today, currently by herbalists. So we usually just use the aerial parts of the plant, everything above ground, and it's a relaxing nervine, which just means it helps the nervous system essentially to function properly. It's one that is used as a remedy for trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. So there's different kinds of insomnia, I guess, or different kinds of sleep problems. This is one that can really help with both that falling asleep and staying asleep, as well as moments of stress, particularly when that stress manifests as muscle tension. So if you're a person that like holds yourself really tightly when you're stressed, this is one that can help with that, as well as like chest constriction and shallow breathing due to anxiety and stress. It's been used to help with alcohol and opioid withdrawal symptoms as well. But it's not one that's used long term. It's just to deal with kind of short term, if you're maybe going through some sort of trauma or, grief or something that is adding to anxiety and stress in your life. It's something to use, for a few month period rather than all the time. And chemical analysis has shown that it does contain several compounds that contribute to sedative activity. So it does have sedative compounds. It transplants really readily. If you find a large patch that you could split up, dig up some root. You can also find some at nurseries, but if you are intending to actually like use it and make tea or tincture or something, you want to ensure that it is Passiflora incarnata and not different species, because there are other passion flower species that look similar but can be toxic. So you really want to make sure that you have your species ID correct. The flowers won't be exactly the same. This is the only one that has this flower. So I have it growing along the fence line where the yard kind of meets the woods in a scrubby area. And once it's established, you don't really need to care for it much at all. Oh, I welcome them. Yeah. Yeah. They always look like, I get certain types of, caterpillars all over things. As long as they're not the ones that are boring into my squash vines, I welcome them. Everything else is fine. But they have a pretty symbiotic relationship. So at least on mine, like I've definitely gotten the fritillaries, but they never like destroyed the plant. It was always like there seemed to be a balance. Yeah, it can become overgrown pretty quickly. Um, Okay, so our next plant, jewelweed. How I recognize this one instantly, at least when it's in flower, the flowers look like little goldfish or little like goldfish lanterns or something. They're so cute. Um, they have this like really distinct kind of matte finish to the leaves as well. If you're looking for it while it's not flowering, we saw a bunch down by like the drainage area and the creek along the trail here, and you can test your ID by dropping a little bit of water on the leaf, and if the water beads and like rolls off them like little glass spheres, then you have jewelweed. Hence, I think the name jewel, like the water rolls off in little jewels. The bottom stem is also hollow. So when you cut it, you can tell if it's hollow. And it's really like mucilaginous, like aloe. So it has a lot of the same properties that you would use aloe pulp for. The plant holds a lot of moisture in its tissues, and it requires a lot of moisture to survive. So it's going to be growing where it can have really wet feet all the time. Historically, the Cherokee would mash the whole plant and use the juice for poison ivy rash. And they may have also, it's thought that they may have also rubbed it all over their skin to actually prevent poison ivy as well. So it would kind of, it actually adds kind of a coating to the skin if you rub the juices all over. An infusion was made also in a bath for women in the final stages of pregnancy. Currently, it's still used, just the aerial parts, as a topical astringent and anti-inflammatory and a moistening agent. And I use it for poison ivy if I get exposed to that. Other skin irritations too, so like bee stings or ant bites or whatever, it's really soothing to those. Sunburn. And you can actually, I will share a recipe for jewelweed ice cubes that I make when it's in season. You just basically put jewelweed in water and blend it in a blender, let that sit overnight, and then freeze it in ice cube tray, or sieve out the plant material and then freeze the liquid in ice cube trays. And if you have a sunburn or poison ivy or something, grab one out of the freezer and just rub yourself down with it. It's really soothing. Yeah, so I'll share that recipe with everybody. If you want to grow it yourself, you do have to have a really wet area. If you do have that kind of moisture, it can be a little bit aggressive. So it's a good plant to fill empty spaces that might be overtaken by non-native weeds. It can be propagated easily by direct sowing the fresh seed in early fall. And it pretty much maintains itself. It's an annual, it's not a perennial, but it really maintains itself through seed dispersal from year to year. And it attracts the ruby-throated hummingbird, the flowers do. All right. Sorry, I'm noticing we're getting close to our time limit, so I'll get to our last few plants here. Pipsissewa, this is a really cute little plant. It is listed by the United Plant Savers. It's kind of an unassuming, it never grows more than about 6 inches tall. I have a real kind of soft spot in my heart for Pipsissewa. Historically, it was kind of used as a cure-all by the Cherokee, and it was a really important plant for indigenous people, mostly because they were eating a lot of wild greens. And like spinach and other greens, that for people who are prone to kidney and bladder stones, these greens contain high concentrations of oxalic acid, which can contribute to the buildup of minerals or stones in kidneys and bladder. So Pipsissewa is specifically a urinary tract analgesic, so pain relieving to the urinary tract, and a kidney tonic. So it was used to cleanse the blood. So chemophila, meaning blood loving. So it helped to cleanse the blood. Currently, it's still one of the go-to herbs in terms of native plants for acute and chronic urinary and kidney issues, but it has a really sparse growing habit. It doesn't transplant very well. I've heard of people, being able to transplant it and grow it, but it's one of those that's really has a reputation for growing only where it wants to, where it already is. So more kind of conservation-minded herbalists use other herbs with similar properties like uva ursi. So it's not one that I would recommend harvesting and using, but it's a nice one to know about and watch bloom with those cute little flowers later on in the summer. Yes, shade-loving. It likes dry woods, typically more acidic soil, so like in pine forests or forests that have more pine. Okay. I hear murmurs. Okay, so we're actually, I think, out of time for the evening. Can I do one more plant and then we'll wrap it up? Okay, we'll do pokeweed and then we'll finish. So pokeweed, yeah, I heard lots of murmurs. This has quite a reputation. It is not one I am recommending anybody go out and harvest because it is toxic, but it has been historically a food source for Appalachian folks and as well as indigenous people who would harvest the early spring greens, boil it, strain the water, boil it, strain the water, boil it, strain the water until it was edible. And they would mix it with like bacon fat and other things to make it eggs. Yeah. And make it into something delicious when there weren't a lot of other green options. And it does have a lot of vitamins and minerals, so it is very nutritive if you process it in the correct way to get the toxicity out. So it is a low-dose botanical. It's been a folk use also for rheumatism. So there are some people that I've met up in the mountains who say, you eat one berry on the first day, 2 on the second, 3 on the third, 4 on the fourth. For 10 days, you eat 10 berries over 10 days to prevent rheumatism for the year ahead. And I would not eat the berries. They are toxic, but it is something that just has a lot of cultural significance for people who have lived in those areas and used it for generations. Currently, it is considered a powerful lymphatic but it's a low-dose botanical, so it's something that I would, only use under really close supervision. And it's also been used to break up masts in breast tissue as well. So I'm gonna scoot us on. There's a few that we missed, and I'm sorry that I could have used 2 hours, apparently. I'm gonna send all of these slides that have, a good amount of information on each of the slides themselves. I'm gonna send a PDF copy to Elise so that she can share that with all of you. I apologize that we didn't get to all of the plants tonight, but I hope you feel a little bit closer to a bunch of the plants that we've talked to. I'm happy to stay for a little while and answer questions you might have. But I'm just so appreciative of everybody who came tonight and listened. That's Mountain Mint. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we might have time for a question or two if people are patient.
I have a question about Solomon seal. What is that for? I have a bunch of them, and I didn't know it was a herbal thing.
Oh, right. So Solomon seal was a really important food source, actually, for Native Americans. So they would, it's a really starchy root or rhizome. So they would actually pound it flat and then add like berries and nuts on top and make almost like a power bar kind of thing that they could take with them on tracks and stuff. And then it's also just like a really restorative tonic herb. So it's
used more in traditional Chinese medicine than Native American or in American herbalism. But it's one of those things kind of similar to ginseng that you would take at the end of an illness or kind of get over something that had been like a long-term or chronic problem to like restore energy and vitality back. It's a really like nutritive, nourishing plant. Yeah.
I just read online somewhere that poke salad also is the juice from it is good to treat poison ivy. Is that true?
Huh. I haven't heard that, but yeah, it's worth testing if you're just using it externally. I know it's just not good to ingest. Yeah. Oh, okay.
That's what we folks cleanse blood.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was one more question over here.
You said for the black cohosh, it could be confused with two plants. What were these two plants that you listed?
So blue cohosh looks really similar and is also actually used as a female reproductive tonic. So blue cohosh, this is maybe not politically correct, but blue cohosh is like what's called maiden's herb, and then black cohosh is called the crone's herb. So it's like one that's more important for like early female reproductive system, and then black cohosh is more important for like later in life female reproductive system. So blue cohosh is one, and then the other one was yellow root. Just the way that the leaves come out of the stem, I think, is really similar, but they grow kind of in different habitats, and black cohosh gets quite a lot bigger than the yellow root.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Melissa, for having come all the way down from Tennessee to spend this evening with us.
Thank you guys so much for being here.